I'm Anna Shackelford with Jamestown Rediscovery, and this is Red Bricks and Burn Earth, the 1639 Church and Bacon's Rebellion. So in Mary Anna's talk, she covered the interior of the church during the Memorial Church excavations. So there's going to be some overlap between our two talks. But I'm going to be talking about 6 of our sites on the exterior of the church that gave us a better understanding of the evolution of the churches on the site, just because the inside was so heavily impacted by features. On the outside, we were able to get a bit of a better look at some of these architectural features. Our first site is located on the north side of the church. That is where we can see the junction between the 2 phases of construction with the 1639 brick foundation and the 1647 brick foundation. So here you can see the 2 builder's trenches. For both of those foundations, we did a reverse excavation, so we removed all that subsoil to see the builder's trenches head on. And just looking at them, you can already see some pretty major differences between the 2. So on the left with the 1639 foundation, you've got this really wide exterior builder's trench. And that's because as the builders are making this foundation, they're building right up against the timber frame. They don't have a whole lot of room to work on the interior. So they have to dig this wider trench on the exterior so that they can actually compensate and work on the exterior. With the 1647 builder's trench on the right side, you can see the builders take a bit of a different approach. It looks like the trench that they dig is only a little bit wider than the foundation itself. It seems like they're working more or less down in that trench along with the foundation as they're laying it. Now, once we take off those builder's trenches, you get a very clear look at both of the foundations. On the inside of the church, we can only see the top few courses of brick. So even though we can see that change in mortar and that distinction between the 2 construction phases, we weren't able to get a good look at the entirety of the foundation. And again, you can see some very obvious differences just looking at the 2. So on the left with the 1639 foundation, you have that light gray, very sturdy mortar. It's very, very clean, and it's distinctly English bond with a 2-course spread footer down at the base. With the 1647 foundation, you've got that tan weak mortar. It's very, very messy. The mortar is just oozing out everywhere. And at a glance, it's English bond. You have those alternating rows of headers, but the alternating rows of stretchers are a bit more randomized. Occasionally, you have a header thrown in there, or just different lengths of brick bats included into the foundation. And also, there is no spread footer. One other piece of evidence that we found at this site is right at the top of the 2 junctions, where we could actually see that that tan mortar from the 1647 foundation was capping the 1639 foundation. And really that just helped to confirm our theory that that eastern portion of the church was built first and the western portion came afterwards since it's capping it. Our next site is located on the south side of the church, and it's the sister site to the junction to the north. But first, we're going to take a look at this overhead where you can actually see an overlay of the 1617 church foundations in yellow and the 1639 brick church foundations in red. And so you can actually see that they are slightly off kilter. They're on different orientations, and it gives you an idea of why on this western end of the church they're having to have these wider builder's trenches to give them more space to work. And then down at the south, which we're about to talk about, you can see they're building right up next to the 1617 church foundations. They have really no room to work with. And so we saw a lot of the same differences between the 2 foundations. But what surprised us here was this angle change that we can see between the 2 phases of construction in the brick church. You can see it a little bit better in this overhead from an orthomosaic. And this is just further evidence that there is a timber frame still standing above ground as they are building this church. On the south side, since they're building so close to the timber frame, above ground, you're going to have portions that are bowing out and interfering with the construction of a brick church. So these foundations they're laying are going to have to account for the timber frame bowing out above ground, and they're going to have to be adjusted during construction. And that's what we see here. But now that we have the entirety of the brick church body covered, what's the relationship between the brick tower and the 1647 church itself? So the next site we're going to look at is right on the corner of the tower and the church. And when we got down to the base of both of the foundations, we can see that they weren't tied into each other. So we know that they had to have been built at separate times. We also dug right underneath the entryway between the tower and the church. And that's because of a drawing by Samuel Young, where he shows this brick hyphen connecting the two structures. But when we took a look, well, we do see this offshoot of brick coming off the west end of the 1647 foundation. It's very clearly been cut through by the church tower. So they had to have been built at separate times, and the tower must have come later. But then what exactly is this offshoot of the brick foundation? So at this point in time, we think that even after they complete the brick church, they're still leaving the very western end of the timber frame standing, since that's where the belfry is, and they're actually tying it into the brick structure. So these brick foundations coming off the west end of the 1647 church are likely a part of a cricket or doorway leading into this timber frame bay. So now the question is, when do they transition from a timber frame belfry into a brick church tower? First, we have to talk about Bacon's Rebellion. So very, very quickly, in 1675, Nathaniel Bacon raises an army and rebels against Governor William Berkeley. Bacon and his army push out to the west, trying to secure more land for the colonists, and they're indiscriminately killing Native Americans. We're on September 19th, 1676. He and his army returned to Jamestown, where Jamestown is burned to the ground. So that includes the State House, numerous private residences, as well as the church. And that leads us to one of our current excavation sites just outside of the tower. And this is where we've actually started finding evidence of Bacon's Rebellion. And really the only reason we're digging here is because of a shovel test pit that we dug right where that light is, where we were able to identify 2 layers of burn-in in the profile. And now after we've opened up a larger excavation site in this area, we can see that the burning forms almost a halo around the brick church tower, and it's comprised of a couple different sections. So you have this black, really charcoaly, carbon-rich material. You have some reddish purple, further thermally altered patches of soil. And then you also have these reddish patches of soil, which we're finding out are the remains of burnt plaster. So on the left, we have a sample that was taken from the Memorial Church during our excavations in there from the 1617 church. And on the right is the intact burnt plaster that we've uncovered at our West Tower site. And so those red patches that it's located on top of may well be the scratch coat, which fell to the ground and smoldered there, just leaving behind this burnt material. This plaster is very likely the remains of that westernmost bay of the timber frame church. When the rebels are boasting about burning down the church of Jamestown, they're talking about this wooden belfry. So it catches fire, falls in this area, and then smolders, leaving behind all this evidence that we're finding today. Directly on top of the burning, we're also finding all sorts of evidence of construction. So we've got these deposits of oyster shell, both burnt and unburnt, which we believe are for producing lime and mixing the mortar for the construction of the church tower right nearby, about 15 feet away, depending on which deposit you're looking at. We also had right along the same level as some late 17th century landscaping fill, these deposits of discarded mortar, which looks very, very similar to the mortar that we see in the foundations of the tower. Even within that late 17th century landscaping fill, we were finding further evidence of the construction of the tower. And that's in the form of window lids, which it's important to emphasize that these have not been burned in any way. They're not a part of this fire event. So they have to be discarded during the construction of the tower. Right now our dates are 1655, 1678, and 1693 from the window lids that we've just uncovered in this area. These are helping us narrow down the date that the brick tower was constructed, which as of now we know is after the 1680s. Our last site is located on the south side of the church, and it's right by the doorway, which is exactly what it is. It is the brick pad entryway for the brick church. And this is evolved right along with the churches on this site. So from 1647 all the way up through the 1680s. The first section we have was built in 1647, and it's that very inner part, and that's based on the mortar. It's very, very similar to the mortar in the 1647 foundation, that very tan, weak mortar. And I should also mention that there could have been another entryway here in 1639, but from what we have, any evidence of that has been erased. So as of now, our date starts in 1647. And then wrapped around it, we have a portico foundation that was likely added in the 1680s as they are constructing the tower on the other side of the church. And again, that's based on the mortar. The mortar that we see in this portico is very, very similar to the mortar in the foundation of the tower. And also because of the inclusion of cobblestones and olive yellow clay, both of which are materials that were used in the 1617 church foundation. So as the tower is being constructed, they're actually cutting through the western corners of that timber frame foundation. So they're pulling all these cobblestones and all this clay out of the ground, and it follows that they would reuse it in this foundation that they're building just a little bit further down the church. And then our last event that we have with this brick pad is post 1680s, just since it's capping that portico foundation there. And it consists of this soft gray mortar, as well as clay, which would have covered all of the bricks in that area, serving as a bed for the tiles, which would have been on the top. And it's sort of repointing or repair event. So we're still continuing our excavations to this day. We're still digging to the west and north of the church tower and finding more evidence as we go along. But just to recap, we start with that 1617 timber frame, and then the brick church body is built in two phases, starting in the east in 1639, and then picking back up in the west in 1647. The last remnants, that westernmost bay of the timber frame, is burned down during Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, and then the brick church tower is built directly afterwards in the 1680s. So thank you for listening to my talk.